You're watching Moontower Soccer's Story of the Week, where Landon Cottam and Jeremiah Bentley discuss this week's most important, consequential, and interesting Austin FC news.
Very happy to be joined by. I'm not blowing smoke up your ass here. Probably my favorite MLS pundit for the last several years now, and the host of Soccer Wise alongside Tom Bogert and Jordan Angeli. It's David Goss. David, thanks so much for being here. We're so happy.
I really appreciate that. Although it's kind of like when you start something with no offense, then it's like, well, now I feel like it was blowing smoke up my ass. So I'm going to assume that's where we're at. But I appreciate that.
All right, I guess let's take a little bit of time off the top just to tell us about Soccer Wise and this new project you've started.
Yeah, I'm really excited about it. So thanks for having me and thanks for bringing it up. And I would love for anyone to join us. So we're just trying to cover, for the most part, MLS and NWSL the way we think they should be covered. And I think one of the biggest issues is the lack of just content around these leagues. And if you're a fan, you don't really have many places to go, and it feels like it's getting less and less. So we're just trying to cover these leagues the way we think fans deserve it, and the way we would want them covered, or the way we do want them covered. And so I do a show live twice a week with Tom Bogert on Tuesdays and Thursdays to talk MLS, 2 p.m. Eastern time, on YouTube, Twitch, Twitter, and then out as a podcast. And then I do a weekend review show every Monday. And then Jordan Angeli joins me to do NWSL specific on Wednesday. And then we have other special shows we do. We've covered a lot of the USMNT and US women's national team and some of the youth stuff as well, live and breaking. But the idea was just to have a place that I think for a lot of us, we are fans of other sports in America or soccer in other countries, and you see the level of coverage and the amount, and we wanted to add some of that for MLS and NWSL fans. And you guys are lucky you're in a market where there's a lot of soccer vibe and it feels real. Other fans in MLS are not in those markets. So we wanted to help meet them there and help grow what has happened so far in some of the better markets. So it's just about having a place where when your team decides they're going to convert TAM into GAM, where are you going to go listen, and where are you going to go hang out, where are you going to talk, and where are you going to be around other fans? I know for me, like, I grew up in New York, sports talk radio. When the Jets lose and the Mets win, the first thing I'm doing that night is I'm putting on WFAN to just be in the vibe and around other fans and just living in those moments a little bit longer. And I think for a lot of us, soccer has had that in a digital platform because that's where we've been able to connect to other soccer fans. And we're just trying to keep growing that and keep adding to it.
Yeah, well, so we have you on because we're an Austin show, and so and what we love is you have this perspective that's much broader than any of us are able to bring to it, because a lot of us have just been Austin fans since this MLS fans since this project started. So just generally, when you think about, there was a build, Claudio Arenda maybe wasn't as great at his job as a lot of people thought, and so Rodolfo Borrell's been to kind of tear it all down. How do you feel about how's the Austin rebuild so far, given it's half a season in?
It's been slower maybe than I expected. And I think part of that is how bad Claudio Arena was at his job and some of the contracts that the team is stuck in. And I think that's the part that from afar has been a little underwhelming, where when you're not in that market, you tune in when things happen and then reassess and you watch for a little and then you get a feeling. It's what we're doing with New England right now, right? Who's flipping rosters and adding pieces and taking pieces away. And Austin, while there's been finally some movement in this summer, it's been a lot slower than expected. And so, when you guys reached out to me and I'm start thinking about Austin specifically, it's there's not a lot new to go find. We haven't seen Bukhari much, so we don't have a lot to go off of. And I think that's one of the problem with the Leagues Cup is you get all excited about a signing. They play 2 games at best, and then you're out for 2 weeks and you've got nothing to watch. But it's just been really slow. And I think this team is a lot closer to last year's team than I would have expected them to be at this point.
Yeah, I think to your point, one thing that's been maybe a little underappreciated or just not known by a lot of folks just paying attention to MLS nationally is that Austin just didn't have the roster spots, and then so many of these contracts are so bad that a lot of these players are unmovable. Who's taking Julio Cascante on 700 or 800K that he's on? Who's taking Jossie Zardes on $1 million the way that he's looked the last couple of years? Nobody's going to take these guys for hands, and at this point, that's what has to happen to have more spots come in. So we're definitely counting down the days. Hopefully we can get into the playoffs and get some type of silver lining on this season, but we're all mostly counting down the day to when a lot of these contracts are over, which not all of them are this season,
Yeah.
but quite a few, enough to make a difference at the end of the season for sure.
Yeah, there was a lot of contracts that were signed for veterans that were long term, which I think the reason a lot of them came to Austin was because it was the place they could get the most years or that most money. And when those don't work out, then you're stuck on the backside. Quick plug, if anyone's interested, at SoccerWise, we have depth charts and salary tables, which have everyone's contract status, contract years laid out. I'm looking at it right now. So it's a very easy place to go and say, Giassi's artist on $1 million for 2024, 2025 with a team option for 2026. So if that stuff interests you, we have that for every team laid out. And it's a really fun one to look at. It is rare to see long-term contracts in MLS. Austin is an outlier in that way. These deals they've signed, like when you go in, we put the option years in purple. Normally you scroll through teams and it's like 24, maybe 25 options. And then you go into Austin and you look at Leo Väisänen through 2027 and Bureau and Gallagher, which I think is a good contract. And I think that's a good deal.
Cheap.
Yeah, 375, having him secured. But you don't see contracts outside of homegrowns for more than 3-4 years normally.
So we were doing some listener questions last week, and we're going to do a few more this week. And I thought this one fit in well to some of the conversation I wanted to have with you. And so this question is from Robert Miller. He asks, given that Burrell's signings have done pretty well this season under Wolf, do you think Austin's problems are due more to roster build or coaching? And then second part of the question is, would you give Wolf a year with Burrell's new signings, like another year with Burrell's signings next year after the rebuild continues? Or would you try to bring in a different coach this offseason? So let's start, I guess, with part one here. Where do you put this Austin team and the troubles that they've experienced as far as like where the blame lies? Is it more to do with roster build, or do you see this as more of a coaching issue?
I'm going to say more roster. I think the injuries alone have been something that very few coaches, I think, could overcome. And then on top of that, you look at the lack of diversity in style of players on the team. One of the like amazing or bizarre parts about the team is Hadar Rion's like the only one who can stretch the field. Every center back has the same deficiencies. It is so odd the way the team was put together over the course of the years, in that not only do you have players in questionable contracts because of age and injury concern, but they all do the same thing, and not in a way where you're like, oh, we have depth. They
Right.
do the same thing in a way in which you don't have the ability to change the game and play in different ways. And I think that's something that's hurt Austin a ton. I think some of that blame can go to Josh Wolf, which is he is single-minded in the way he sees the game. So I'm sure he has always leaned the signings into the type of players he wants, high possession players, short passing players, all of that type of stuff. But I don't think that's fully, at his feet. And that doesn't affect whether or not you think he can coach the new players coming in. And it's very obvious from the profile of players that have been brought in that Rodolfo Burrell sees this and is looking for new aspects in players that he's bringing in, Bukhari being the biggest one, a player who can stretch the field and can break down defenders and doesn't always need to connect and link up and have overloads and have more players in the area to create chances. So I would put most of the blame at that. I don't know if a coach can change culture then once they're already in. And I think that would be the concerning part, which is it's gotten a little bit rotten over the course of the last year. And you have moments where it feels like the team has given up. And so if you bring in new pieces, are you endangering the whole project by having someone there who maybe some of the players don't respect or don't connect with, or have already heard the message long enough and it can't get over it? I think that's the fear. I would say you give him the end of this year because you're not going to sign anyone else over the course of the end of this year. And if Rodolfo Burrell is going to sign a new coach, he's probably got a couple names in mind. He's been around soccer pretty long, and like he would get that done in the off season.
Yeah, I kind of imagine this scenario. I mean, like, so Burrell came out like right out of the gates, like full voice support for Josh Wolf, saying like, this is the guy, this is one of the reasons I came here. Who knows how true any of that is and how much he's just trying to kind of drum up support for the team. I like to imagine this scenario where like Josh Wolf, in my opinion, is not a coach that's going to like drag a team down so much. I think if Josh Wolf was coaching the Crew or LAFC, they would still be very good teams.
Yeah.
And so I think with a good roster, Josh Wolf could be successful. I don't know that he's necessarily a guy who is going to elevate a good team like we've seen other coaches do in this league. And so I would like to make a change. But you talk about Burrell maybe having a list of names. How many of those guys are in Europe? And does that mean we're going to have to wait until next summer to bring them in?
Yeah.
And so I keep picturing this scenario where if Burrell has another window like he did this summer and like rebuilds the team well enough that the team is so good that they're actually winning, and then he wants to fire Wolf, but then he's in a tough spot because like, oh wait, we're actually good. Does it become hard to fire a guy if you rebuild the team so well that they start winning?
Yes. I think this scenario in which he wants a European coach who would come next summer, I don't think Josh Wolf is the coach at the start of the year. So there's either an obvious interim brought in where it's like clear that it's an interim manager, whether it's pulling someone out of the academy that's local, or someone from Rodolfo Burrell's past who's probably going to be an assistant for the next coach. The other odd part about this whole thing, and I don't know how Austin fans are talking about this, is Rodolfo Burrell's a coach. Like, that's a large part, if not the larger part of his background.
Yeah.
My understanding is he has been offered or interviewed for MLS head coaching roles in the past before doing this. And so he'd already been in those conversations. I don't know if that's his desire anymore. So he could be the guy. And that's pretty simple to find to make sure he wants to be available because it's just himself. If that was the case, I wouldn't be shocked if he said, well, I don't want to manage this roster and like waits through the end of this year and then takes over. Or I wouldn't be shocked if the person he wants is already an assistant and could leave, because your assumption would be at the level he's been at and now asking someone to come into, it's going to be more of a pretty good example is Minnesota United signing Eric Ramsey, right? A young assistant coach from Manchester United. Like, here's a chance to be a head coach in a new world, like in a new setup, all these things. It's probably not going to be a head coach out of the Man City La Liga background that he's in. It's probably someone a little bit further down that he either believes could be better or has a relationship with already. But there are ways to set yourself up. Minnesota did it where you can have an interim going through. I couldn't see a world in which there's a name or a person they specifically want and Josh Wolf manages the team up until that point.
That's
right. Yeah, that's. Sorry, go ahead, Jeremiah.
No, I was going to follow up a little bit because you were talking about like WFA and the Jets and the Mets. Like, one thing I think it's interesting that a lot of people we talk to who have been like American sports fans for forever is just like the level of patience with a coach or a manager or even a sporting director and how different it is in this sport, in this world. And even now, like in the United States, like, can you expand on that a little bit? Because I feel like it's a new thing for a lot of people who are like, if followed expansion teams in the NFL or Major League Baseball, we're like, well, the guy coaches for like 7 years. Maybe we get good, or maybe they don't. And it's like not this way in soccer.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of that comes from the background overseas of promotion relegation, right? So you get fired because your team has like basically lost, where there is a bottom in American sports because, well, you got the number one pick and Reggie Bush will make the team better next year and all those types of things. But there is still a culture, I think, now developing the MLS with expectations, and also people like Rodolfo Burrell who come from backgrounds where losing is unacceptable because it could end the club, right? There are clubs that go through relegations where they won't exist the same way that they used to. And so you have those expectations. And I think in MLS, with the way the salary structure is, it is fair for every team to expect to win, because there is not that large a gap between the top and the bottom. And so what we've seen is, rather than have the threat of relegation being the driver, it's the lack of success that's been the driver for a lot of firings. And MLS has, you hear all the time people say like, oh, well, you can build a real project, you get time, but it is one of the leading leagues in the world in terms of firings now, and how quickly they happen and how consistently they happen, and all across the season. There is like very little rhyme or reason to the moments that they occur. It's not always before the season, you know, in the off season, summer transfer window, then when you don't qualify for the playoffs. Like, we see them in May and June and July and all across until the end of the year. And so I think now for a lot of clubs, they look around and say, FC Cincinnati was the worst team in the league, and then 18 months later, they were the best team in the league. We should be competing. And if we're not competing, the quickest move to make is to fire the one manager rather than to go across and get rid of all the players, where then, the NFL, if you have a quarterback or you don't, that's kind of the whole conversation. But in basketball, it's like, well, you swap one player out, you could change the dynamics of a team. That's a little bit harder in soccer. And so the easiest and most straightforward move to make is to fire a manager.
So I don't know how much everyone listening will know this, but David, you are like not exaggerating this. You are maybe one of the people who knows the most about American youth soccer in the country. Is just from covering it. I know you announced games for all kinds of places, and then just followed it really closely. We wanted to get your take on Austin FC's, I guess, like academy and second team pipeline. So last season, Austin FC wins MLS Next Pro championship. This year, they end up moving off a lot of the guys who won that game or won that championship, brought in a lot of younger guys, players from the academy, other guys that they've brought in, and are, like, as expected, doing quite a bit worse. Where do you think the balance is in a development team? Like, is it okay to play kids in a league where they're going to get the crap kicked out of them for most of the season? Or, like, does being competitive matter in a development atmosphere?
There is a balance that's necessary, and being terrible doesn't teach you anything. And, like, yes, losing helps sometimes, and, like, we all know the dream team had to lose one time so that you could get coached. That's not these kids' scenario, and it's, I think, been proven pretty strongly that the teams that just have no chance and the kids just get decimated for 2 years, most of those players don't develop out of those setups because you don't have anything you can learn positively. So it's like, yeah, you can learn, okay, last week this worked and this week this didn't work, and the veteran does it this way. But if you just lose every single time, you have no frame of reference to what would have worked or what could have been better. You also lack confidence. Like, soccer is so much about the mental side of things. And that's part of why, by the way, I think coaching changes a ton, because there's this belief that, like, teams that play with confidence, with the wind at their backs, where the game feels easier, all those moments, they will be successful, even if the talent isn't there. So you have to give young players the opportunity to have that. And so you need to find a balance. And I think some of the best development teams have done that, where they've gone out and found a 25-year-old who kind of knows their place and where they're at and wants a little stability, or wants to live in that city, or is from the club. Because that's one of the things that's starting to happen now, is you have people who grow up in a club, go to college, play a couple years of pro, want to come back home, or want to be a part of that club no matter what. You can also find players who are trying to get their opportunities, who believe that they are good enough, whether it's coming out of the CPL or USL or from Central America or the Caribbean or whatever it is, that are willing to come into the team and fight for their spot. And you put young players around those players, and it's not about winning championships, but it's about being competitive week to week so that the players can learn winning traits and can feel the experience of being a professional, but doing it the right way. Now, Austin was in a weird spot, and we've seen expansion clubs be in these weird spots, which is you're trying to catch up. Like, you don't have 10 years of academy players to push through into a second team. So you have to fill that gap with college draft players, some older players, some academy pieces out of other clubs. We've seen Columbus do this really well over the last 2 years, and Columbus has made the same move that Austin made, which is, okay, now we feel like our academy is strong enough, so we're going to move a lot of these pieces out, and we're going to push our own young players through. But you always have to do it with a balance. You always have to give those kids an opportunity to learn from true professionals, and that's, like, one of the keys to this whole setup. I think it's one of the great losses in MLS Next Pro is that you don't have the experience to then go and see pros at a Tampa and at a Detroit and at a Orange County or Vegas. And I think that hurts a lot of the players, but that's league stuff. You can only control your team. And I think to control your team correctly, that's what you have to do. I would say for that Austin team last year, there were a lot of really interesting pieces in that team. You don't need 12 of them, but you need 3 or 4 to be a part of it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's been interesting to see over the last few years. You mentioned, like, Austin just now are, like, the first academy class that came all the way through. Micah Burton was in that group, and he's 17, 18 years old playing with the MLS Next Pro team. I think there's one other kid that was in that initial class that played, I think, 1 or 2 games, and he's off to college now. But I'm curious to see if they can continue that continuity of, okay, yeah, there are a handful of kids that are not from Austin, did not come all the way through, but played several years in the academy and are now getting minutes with the MLS Next Pro team. If they can continue that pipeline, and actually, now that there are some kids coming out the other end of it, if they can kind of keep the continuity going.
And they made the decision, I think, that a lot of clubs have made, where they started right at the U12s or U13s, and they grew each age group by pushing that group through. Not every club has done it that way. Some clubs start their full academy, and they just you try and find players to load in at those different ages. And we have seen Minnesota the most, and now it's like chaos with what Minnesota has done, where Minnesota did that and then sort of tried to get claims on players who they didn't develop, which is fine. Every MLS team does it. Every team in the world does it. And then try and find those players at 17 and 18 and whatever to accelerate things. But LAFC did the same as what Austin did, which was start with that 12 age group and then keep backfilling another age group as you push them through. But it means from the moment you start, you're probably 7 years away from a player making a difference on your first team. It is now, in this salary cap league, a loss of an asset, because homegrown players are now genuine pieces of a roster where they are cheap, affordable, mainly domestic players who can fill in and be game changers for your team and be good pieces for your team, while you then spend more money on the top half. And I think it's part of what's hurt Austin, and there's really no genuine way to accelerate it early on, which is they can't have a couple backup fullbacks and a starting defensive midfielder who are off the salary cap and off the books, so then you can spend all the money on a TAM center back. And I think Austin has ended up being spread a little bit too thin across their roster on some of their salary cap money, because they don't have the homegrowns as options.
We got to keep Josh around long enough to get the next Wolf into a homegrown deal.
I will tell you, I think Gavin's probably the best of the three of them. Wow. And he's clearly in a conversation right now, and he's very young, where he is like, because people always ask me, center back's such a problem for the U.S. The center back prospect pool is incredible for the U.S. across MLS Next right now. Some of the best players in MLS Next are center backs, and Gavin Wolf is at the top of that list with all of them. So yes, keep Josh Wolf around to get Gavin into the first team.
Okay, so we'd be remiss not to bring this up while we have your MLS expertise. One of the most MLS-iest things happened in Austin the other day. I've decided to name it the day that will live in Gamfamy. I have a button for this. There we go. So Austin, where do we even start here? So MLS announced new rules recently, where you can take one of two routes: 3 DPs and 3 U22s, or 2 DPs and 4 U22s. Austin announced that they decided on the latter of those two options. That therefore gave them $1 million in GAM, and it's kind of like the snake eating its own tail, that they needed to have 2 DPs to choose this one, but they needed the $1 million to get to 2 DPs. And so they got the $1 million to buy down one of their DPs. But all this happened at the end of the transfer window, when Austin has no senior roster spots. And then part of this move is they traded away their last international roster spot. And so I guess our question is, like, why did any of this matter?
It is a good question, and I might not even have the right answer. My guess from the outside is, so Alex Ring is that low-end DP that they bought down. He is like $100,000 to $200,000 off that DP number. My guess is the rest of the pieces in the roster were built in a way where the assumption was they were going to make this move, but MLS hadn't put the rule in yet, so they didn't actually get the allocation money. But the roster is built in a way in which the roster is over the salary cap number, and they needed the rest of the $1 million to buy enough pieces down to fit in. So my assumption being, you use the 100 or 200,000 you need to buy Alex Ring down, and then the rest went into Giassi Zardes and Matt Hedges. And what are the other pieces were, in which Austin knew coming into the window that they didn't have enough space in their salary cap, and that they were going to make this move to then clean up the salary cap book and be able to get under so that they could play out the rest of the season. And that might have gone hand in hand with some of the moves they made. Dessler's money may have been too much for them to really add, and they knew that they were going to use this money to buy it down. the issue for everyone in the league was MLS told everyone these were going to be the rules months ago and then didn't put them in place until the end. So there was nothing. Austin couldn't have announced this earlier because the rule didn't exist. And then MLS decided they were going to do this National Signing Day where everyone grabbed the hat of two DPs and 4 U22s at 3 and 3, and did the little joke thing where they picked which one, who knows. And so there was like no other time to have done it. But my guess is they've been operating with the assumption that this was money they were going to have and going to use the entire time they were working through the window. The only thing that's a little surprising is that they didn't sign other U22s. That's like the only
don't
other
have senior
part.
roster spots.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's a good point. Yeah, so you would have had to either buy someone out or trade someone.
And
the
nobody
trade
wants any more
someone is the
players.
problem. Yeah, that is
Like,
the
that's
main issue.
Yeah.
It is wild when you do the like, oh, what we're like, especially with the injuries in the league, because Cincinnati has all the injuries at center back and all these things, and you're like, no one's coming to get these guys. This is not the place people are gonna go hunting. Danny Pereira is the big one, right? They could basically sell him inside the league, and it sounded like that was the offer that came. Was it LAFC last year?
That was the rumor. It was never
Right.
like widely reported,
Right.
but there is a rumor for sure.
That would be the way that you'd get out of it. It's kind of what Montreal did with Mason Toye and guys like that this window. And then on the flip side, what Toronto did to them, which was sold Jaquil Marshall-Ruddy, basically sold in league for $1 million allocation money. But you have to have an asset. And my assumption would be Gallagher and Pereira, maybe Stuver as well, would be the only ones.
Yeah, I think it made some sense at the time, but in hindsight, I think it makes the Diego Fagundes trade make 100 times more sense.
Yeah.
When you look at the number he was on and his production during that year. If someone offers you $1 million, you take it. And because we're seeing now, like as many moves as we made, like how many of these would have not been possible if Fagundes was still on this team. So
Yeah.
So I wanted to, the theory that you gave, I think makes more sense, being that some of these new guys that we brought in pushed our accounting over what we could actually afford for this window. Some other theories that, I guess the one that I had was that they were actually trying to make some other moves happen and they needed this in order to actually make them happen. But those moves didn't come through. They couldn't get a guy out, so they couldn't bring a new guy in, something like that. The other one that Mike Cragnola brought up to me that I've seen floating around is that they wanted to buy down Alex Ring, but wanted to do it with expiring allocation money as opposed to, let's say, for instance, the Diego Fagundes money, just maybe that's still hanging around in their coffers. And they can, if you trade for it, you can use it again in the future. But this like new rule money expires at the end of the season. And so you want to buy down Ring. Here's a way you can do it with money that only exists this year as opposed to money you could use in the offseason.
But the question, yeah, I guess then, but in that theory or in that setup, you're probably still doing it for the same reason we talked about at first, which is to get the money for other guys. Because if you're just buying Alex Ring down, but you're not adding a DP, you don't need to buy him down. Like there's no reason to do it unless you need the rest of the $1 million in allocation to use for something else. Because otherwise you would just leave him as the DP for this year, because next year he's got the team option. So like he's off that contract and he's gone after this year. I don't know if, and this is one of the things I was thinking about when you were talking to me about it earlier, and I haven't reached out to find from anyone. I don't know if you can restructure any contracts using the allocation. That would be the other thing, is if you said to Giassi Zardes, why don't we bump you up to 1.3 this year? We'll give you 300,000 out of our allocation so we can bring your number down next year, where they would in theory be making more moves and have more flexibility. I don't know if you're even allowed to do that. That would be the only other reason I could really see, where you're saying, like, can we basically bite the bullet this season where we know we can't get better and we don't have the ability to make moves?
So you said that Ring is potentially out at the end of the season. If you remember, last year he was on an option year also, but it got auto-triggered by like minute. I don't guess we ever got an exact reason why it was auto-triggered, but it was auto-triggered. Do we think any of this points to that Alex Ring has another auto-trigger clause in his contract and he's definitely, we're definitely on the hook for him?
I can promise you from the conversations I've had that there is a board somewhere now in Rodolfo Borrell's office space that says, here are the auto triggers for every player's contract because they seem to not be happy with the way that went down last year and felt like it was a little bit out of their control. The Rigoni stuff, right? We already saw it. Like they refused to play Rigoni to not auto trigger his bonuses and some of those moves. So clearly they are now in place enough in a way to have read through all the contracts and figured out where all those moments are. But I will say it feels like Alex Ring's been on borrowed time for most of his time in Austin, and yet he somehow survived. So I'm sure we'll be having the same convo in about a year.
Maybe, yeah, no doubt.
We say it every week pretty much that Alex Ring is a perfectly fine player on half the money he's making and like not on a DP spot.
Yeah, he's
I'd
good at
gladly have
some
him on the
things.
team.
He's not great at anything, and he's not as good at all the things he used to be good at.
Right.
But he
It's
would
the,
be
the
fine.
opportunity cost of what you don't have in that DP place when he's taking it up is the biggest thing. It's less of a complaint about him and more of a complaint about who he's not.
In the DP convo, though, can I just say Bukhari looks fun. Like the few minutes we've seen, he's got a bag of tricks and he's not scared to use it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's super exciting about him. Listeners will know I've got like Mikael Dessler is my soccer crush at the moment.
You are.
I was
He's
super
over the
high
top
on him
about it,
since
yeah.
the rumor started.
Nice.
And he's been super good. Like I'm very happy with like he's everything I hoped he would be. So
Yeah.
Bukhari I think is gonna be like he's shown that he's got magic in him, but Dessler is one of these guys who just like I have referred to him as like the right back version of Robin Lod. Like you know exactly what you're getting from him every week,
Super
and it's going to
clean,
be really good.
Yeah. I think they're very, from what I've heard, they're very excited about those two ads. And if you get one or two guys that you can lean on, especially Bukhari, then all of a sudden it's like, yeah, Jesse's Art is still a pretty good soccer player. Diego Rubio is a decent soccer player. Hunter O'Brien has his moments. It's when you take them away from being the stars, like you talked about with Alex Ring, of like when they can lean on someone else, when someone else can carry the game for long stretches, then you start to say like this group can be competitive. And then you start to see the holes of like, where are we one or two pieces away? And I think that's been, as we started this whole thing, the frustrating part with Austin of how similar the team was to start this year as it was to last year.
David, you're making us feel really smart right now by saying a lot of the stuff that we've been saying.
I got you.
Yeah, okay. So before we let you go, you sort of touched on, or we've talked about like the importance of independent media, like covering the league, and now that you are independent media, maybe like what does that mean? What for like different perspective does that give for fans? Like, do we see more of it down the road? I know it's like the media model is very tough in terms of like finances right now, but like what's your crystal ball vision of that for the future?
I have zero idea. I wish I had a better answer on the crystal ball because then I would be making more money and doing more things. It's all about the growth of the league, right? If there's more fans that care, then there's more people that want coverage. I will say a positive thing about MLS, one of the positive things, or one of the few, whichever term you want to go with, is pretty much every expansion market has hit over the last 5-7 years. And each expansion market brings in 20 to 200,000 fans like out the door, out the gate, right? You immediately are selling out a stadium. You've immediately got supporter sections. You immediately have this tentpole thing that those people in that area care about. And so now you can pull those fans in. So I think that's where there's opportunity, is like there are more hardcore fans and there are more people who care. And the growth is coming less from finding more fans to bring in, and the fact that like each market brings in a ton of new fans every single time. And I think we've seen it in the strength of some of the coverage in some of those markets. Like Cincinnati has done really well with the coverage they have of their team. St. Louis has done really well. You guys know, of course, there was, the strikers started out of Austin and all of that. And so I think when you find those markets where then you can have a base where you can guarantee something off of, then you can start to take some risks and grow a little bit. And I think everyone's hope is with the World Cup coming in 2026 and hopefully another World Cup coming in 2031, that there will be these bigger events to bring more money into the ecosystem. In terms of why it's important, I think you want differing opinions. You want debate. Like, this is why sports are fun, right? We can all have different points of view and we can complain about stuff and yell about stuff and say ridiculous things. It's something that brings us all together. It's a little bit harder when it's controlled by the entity that's being discussed. It's hard to make fun of something that pays you and operates you.
As good as MLS has done at like being their own, like waving their own flag and kind of like priming the pump to get more media because no one else was doing it. And so they had to kind of fill that space. But it's getting to a point now where like the attention is growing and it's not healthy to have the primary like media body be owned and their paychecks paid by the league. And I'm not criticizing anybody who's doing that. If you can make that money, get it. But it's
And-
like it has to be a healthy thing for there to be more things happening outside of that bubble.
And it's, I think, the way any of the healthy leagues operate is you have external entities, talking about and covering things that internal entities wouldn't. And it creates more conversation and it creates more buzz. And, I think, I'm sure you guys see this even with your own numbers. Signings and rumors, that's what drives attention. That's the moments that grab people outside of the games. And so if you're not broadcasting the games, the other things that are happening around those are these news stories, which are not something that you're going to come out and be like, oh, hey, yeah, we might trade our left back. Also, we'll see him at training later. Like, that will be fun. You need to have entities outside of that are covering things. So that's our hope in what we're trying to do. I think there's also, we don't 100% know exactly what our fans do want because we haven't really gotten to do it yet. And so I think I'm learning already, like, what people engage with and what people react to. And maybe it's not always transfer rumors or firings and stuff like that. Although it tends to be a lot of that.
Yeah.
And so angry fans will always show up. Happy fans will come half the time. Angry fans are there 100% of the time. Nothing drives us like rage. And so I think that's a large part of it as well. But I think it's the only way to have a true standard healthy league. And so I think it's part of the ecosystem. It's not the only part of it, but I think it has to be a part of it.
Do you think we ever get to a point where MLS is covered as like a true top 5 sport in America? Or do you think that era is kind of gone and MLS is going to move into whatever comes next, where it is a more segmented market where stuff like Soccer Wise is kind of the thing, or like other smaller things that are happening in, I guess, like more numbers, but smaller reach.
Yeah.
Is that going to be kind of the model forward?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's one of those I think a lot of people are chasing, which is like, again, like you guys said, we don't know where media exists. I guess if you were to ask what's the formula for it to happen, it follows the popularity of the league and the players. And I think that starts with the U.S. winning a 2026 World Cup and those players becoming stars and those players coming into Major League Soccer. And then that adds on top of the next set of the Messis and the Girouds and the Griezmanns. And I do think there is a way in which MLS is seen as a legitimate top 5 league, on the men's side, at least in America. I think there's a good chance NWSL jumps a lot of this, and MLS then is sort of following NWSL's model, because that's, I think, what we're about to see is like, as Mel Swanson and Trinity Rodman and Sophia Smith come back to the US and start traveling around the country and playing now post a gold medal, that's the model that MLS is going to try and follow on the men's side. And we're going to see how it works and how people engage with it and how it gets covered and what you can do to spur that forward. But that would be the formula for the league to get big enough. And if it does, then it will get talked about in all of those places. But I think even when you look at like, and this is not my expertise, but even when you look at like MMA and stuff like that, it is still normally an expert brought in. It is not the host is an expert, right? The host can do NFL and MLB playoffs and NBA by themselves, but they're still going to bring someone in to talk those other sports, even though they'll do it regularly. I think that's probably best case scenario that you're getting to with MLS over the next 10 to 15 years.
All right. Well, Tom, I almost called you Tom Bogert. David, thanks.
No one can see my mustache right now because it's a podcast.
That's what I was saying.
Thanks so much for joining us. This has been a pleasure, and we appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Everyone listen to Soccer Wise if you get the chance, and join our Patreon so you can jump into our Discord, which I know you are in, and you guys can go in there and yell at me and then talk to me, and we can do all those things, and we can talk about soccer, and I'm always happy to talk Austin FC in there, and hopefully be on once again when we do a playoff preview at some point over the next 5 to 10 years.
Oh, man. Hopefully sooner.
Hopefully.
All right, thanks, David.
If you like this video, you can listen to the full episode at moontowersoccer.com or wherever you get your podcasts.